No, I didn't. Hey, this is Abstract Passages with Ben.
And April.
And my guest host, April. And we were reading from chapter something of Solaris. Chapters aren't numbered. Take it away, April.
Berton's report, divided into two parts and complete with a summary of his log, occupied the place of honor in the book. From 1400 hours to 1640 hours, by expedition time, the entries in the log were laconic and negative.
Altitude 3,000, or 3,500, 2,500 feet. Nothing visible. Ocean empty.
The same words recurred over and over again. Then, at 1640 hours,
A red mist rising. Visibility 700 yards. Ocean empty.
1700 hours,
Fog thickening. Visibility 400 yards, with clear patches descending to 600 feet.
1720 hours,
In fog. Altitude 600. Visibility 20 to 40 yards, climbing to 1,200.
1745,
Altitude 1,500. Pall of fog to horizon. Funnel-shaped openings through which I can see ocean surface. Attempting to enter one of these clearings. Something is moving.
1752,
Have spotted what appears to be a water spout. It is throwing up a yellow foam. Surrounded by a wall of fog. Altitude 300. Descending to 60 feet.
The extract from Berton's log stopped at this point. There followed his case history, or, more precisely, the statement dictated by Berton and interrupted at intervals by questions from the members of the Commission of Enquiry.
When I reached 100 feet, it became very difficult to maintain altitude because of the violent gusts of wind inside the cone. I had to hang on to the controls, and for a short period, about 10 or 15 minutes, I did not look outside. I realized too late that a powerful undertow was dragging me back into the fog. It wasn't like an ordinary fog. It was a thick colloidal substance which coated my windows. I had a lot of trouble cleaning them. That fog, or glue rather, was obstinate stuff. Due to this resistance, the speed of my rotor blades was reduced by 30%, and I began losing height. I was afraid of capsizing on the waves, but even at full power, I could maintain altitude but not increase it. I still had 4 booster rockets left, but felt the situation was not yet desperate enough to use them. The aircraft was shaken by shuddering vibrations that grew more and more violent. Thinking my rotor blades must have become coated with the gluey substance, I glanced at the overload indicator, but to my surprise it read 0. Since entering the fog, I had not seen the sun, only a red glow. I continued to fly around in the hope of emerging into one of the funnels, which, after half an hour, was what happened. I found myself in a new well, perfectly cylindrical in shape, and several hundred yards in diameter. The walls of the cylinder were formed by an enormous whirlpool of fog, spiraling upwards. I struggled to keep in the middle, where the wind was less violent. It was then that I noticed a change in the ocean's surface. The waves had almost completely disappeared, and the upper layer of the fluid, or whatever the ocean is made of, was becoming transparent, with murky streaks here and there, which gradually dissolved until finally it was perfectly clear. I could see distinctly to a depth of several yards. I saw a sort of yellow sludge which was sprouting vertical filaments. When these filaments emerged above the surface, they had a glassy sheen. Then they began to exude foam. They frothed until the foam solidified. It was like a very thick treacle. These glutinous filaments merged and became intertwined. Great bubbles swelled up on the surface and slowly began to change shape. Suddenly I realized that my machine was being driven towards the wall of fog. I had to maneuver against the wind, and when I was able to look down again, I saw something which looked like a garden. Yes, a garden. Trees, hedges, paths. But it wasn't a real garden. It was all made of the same substance, which had hardened and by now looked like yellow plaster. Beneath this garden, the ocean glittered. I came down as low as I dared in order to take a closer look.
Did the trees and plants you saw have leaves on them?
No. The shapes were only approximate, like a model garden. That's exactly what it was like. A model, but life-size. All of a sudden, it began to crack, broke up and split into dark crevices. A thick white liquid ran out and collected into pools, or else drained away. The earthquake became more violent. The whole thing boiled over and was buried beneath the foam. At the same time, the walls of fog began to close in. I gained height rapidly and came clear at 1,000 feet.
Are you absolutely sure that what you saw resembled a garden? There was no other possible interpretation?
Yes. I noticed several details. For example, I remember seeing a place where there were some boxes in a row. I realized later that they were probably beehives.
You realized later, but not at the time, not at the moment when you actually saw them?
No, because everything looked as though it were made of plaster. But I saw something else.
What was that?
I saw things which I can't put a name to, because I didn't have time to examine them carefully. Under some bushes, I thought I saw tools, long objects with prongs. They might have been plaster models of garden tools, but I'm not entirely certain. Whereas I am sure, quite certain, that I recognized an apiary.
It didn't occur to you that it might be an hallucination?
No! I thought it was a mirage. It never occurred to me that it was a hallucination because I felt perfectly well and I had never seen anything like it before. When I reached 1,000 feet and took another look at the fog, it was pitted with more irregularly shaped holes, rather like a piece of cheese. Some of these holes were completely hollow, and I could see the ocean waves. Others were only shallow saucers in which something was bubbling. I descended another well and saw the altimeter read 120 feet. I saw a wall lying beneath the ocean surface. It wasn't very deep, and I could see it clearly beneath the waves. It seemed to be a wall of a huge building, pierced with rectangular openings like windows. I even thought I could see something moving behind them, but I couldn't be absolutely certain of that. The wall slowly broke the surface, and a mucus bubbling liquid streamed down its sides. Then it suddenly broke in half and disappeared into the depths. I regained height and continued to fly above the fog, the machine almost touching it, until I discovered another clearing, much larger than the previous one. While I was some distance away, I noticed a pale, almost white object floating on the surface. My first thought was that it was Fechner's flying suit, especially as it looked vaguely human in form. I brought the aircraft round sharply, afraid of losing my way and being unable to find the same spot again. The shape, the body, it was moving. Sometimes it seemed to be standing upright in the trough of the waves. I accelerated and went down, so low that the machine bounced gently. I must have hit the crest of a huge wave I was overflying. The body, yes, it was a human body, not an atmosphere suit. The body was moving.
Did you see its face?
Yes,
Who was it?
it was a child.
What child? Did you recognize it?
No. At any rate, I don't remember having seen it before. Besides, when I got closer, when I was 40 yards away, or even sooner, I realized that it was no ordinary child.
What do you mean?
I'll explain. At first, I couldn't understand what worried me about it. It was only after a minute or two that I realized this child was extraordinarily large. Enormous, in fact. Stretched out horizontally, its body rose 12 feet above the surface of the ocean. I swear. I remembered that when I touched the wave, its face was a little higher than mine, even though my cockpit must have been at least 10 feet above the ocean.
If it was as big as that, what makes you say it was a child?
Because it was a tiny child!
Do you realize, Berton, that your answer doesn't make sense?
On the contrary, I could see its face, and it was a very young child. Besides, its proportions corresponded exactly to the proportions of a child's body. It was a babe in arms. I exaggerate. It was probably 2 or 3 years old. It had black hair and blue eyes, enormous blue eyes. It was naked, completely naked, like a newborn baby. It was wet, or I should say glossy. Its skin was shiny. I was shattered. I no longer thought it was a mirage. I could see this child so distinctly. It rose and fell with the waves. But apart from this general motion, it was making other movements, and they were fucking horrible.
Why? What was it doing?
It was more like a doll in a museum, only a living doll. It opened and closed its mouth and made various gestures, horrible gestures.
What do you mean?
I was watching it from about 20 yards away. I don't suppose I went any closer, but as I've already told you, it was enormous. I could see very clearly. Its eyes sparkled, and you really would have thought it was a living child. If it hadn't been for the movements, the gestures, as though someone was trying, it was as though someone else was responsible for the gestures.
Try to be more explicit?
It's difficult. I'm talking of an impression, more of an intuition. I didn't analyze it, but I knew that those gestures, they weren't natural.
Do you mean, for example, that the hands didn't move as human hands would move because the joints were not sufficiently supple?
No, not at all. But these movements had no meaning. Each of our movements means something, more or less, serves some purpose.
Do you think so? The movements of an infant don't have much meaning.
I know. But an infant's movements are confused, random, uncoordinated. The movements I saw were yes, that's it. They were methodical movements. They were performed one after another, like a series of exercises, as though someone had wanted to make a study of what this child was capable of doing with its hands, its torso, its mouth. The face was more horrifying than the rest, because the human face has an expression, and this face, I don't know how to describe it. It was alive, yes, but it wasn't human, or rather, the features as a whole, the eyes, the complexion were, but the expression, the movements of the face, were certainly not.
Were they grimaces? Do Do you know what happens to a person's face during an epileptic fit?
Yes. I've watched an epileptic fit. I know what you mean. No, it was something quite different. Epilepsy provokes spasms, convulsions. The movements I'm talking about were fluid, continuous, graceful, melodious, if you can say that of a movement. It's the nearest definition I can think of. But this face, the face can't divide itself in two. One half gay, the other sad, one half scowling and the other amiable, one half frightened and the other triumphant. But that's how it was with this child's face. In addition to that, all these movements and changes of expression succeeded, one after another, with unbelievable rapidity. I stayed down there a very short time, perhaps 10 seconds, perhaps less.
And you claim to have seen all that in such a short time? Besides, how do you know how long you were there? Did you check your chronometer?
No. But I've been flying for 17 years, and in my job, one can measure instinctively, to the nearest second, the duration of what would be called an instant of time. It's an acquired faculty, and essential for successful navigation. A pilot isn't worth his salt if he can't tell whether a particular phenomenon lasts 5 or 10 seconds, whatever the circumstances. It's the same with observation. We learn over the years to take in everything at a glance.
Is that all you saw?
No. But I don't remember the rest so precisely. I suppose I must already have seen more than enough. My attention faltered. The fog began to close in, and I had to climb. I climbed, and I climbed, and for the first time in my life, I all but capsized. My hands were shaking so much that I had difficulty in handling the controls. I think I shouted something, called up to the base, even though I knew we were not in radio contact.
Did you then try and get back?
No. In the end, having gained height, I thought to myself that Fechner was probably in the bottom of one of the wells. I know it sounds crazy, but that's what I thought. I told myself that everything was possible and that it would be possible for me to find Fechner. I decided to investigate every clearing I came across along my route. At the third attempt, I gave up. When I had regained height, I knew it was useless to persist after what I had just seen on this, the third occasion. I couldn't go on any longer. I should add, as you already know, that I was suffering from bouts of nausea and that I vomited in my cockpit. I couldn't understand it. I'd never been sick in my life.
Listen, it was a symptom of poisoning.
Perhaps. I don't know. But what I saw on this third occasion, I didn't imagine. That was not the effect of poisoning.
How can you possibly know? How can you know that?
It wasn't a hallucination. A hallucination is created by one's own brain, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yes.
Well, my brain couldn't have created what I saw. I'll never believe that. My brain wouldn't have been capable of it.
Get on with describing what it was.
Before I do, I should like to know how the statements I've already made will be interpreted.
What does that matter?
For me, it matters very much indeed. I have said that I saw things which I shall never forget. If the Commission recognizes, even with certain reservations, that my testimony is credible and that a study of the ocean must be undertaken, I mean a study oriented in light of my statements, then I'll tell you everything. But if the Commission considers that is all delusions, then I refuse to say anything more.
Why?
Because the contents of my hallucinations belong to me, and I don't have to give an account of them. Whereas I am obliged to give an account of what I saw on Solaris.
Does that mean that you refuse to answer any more questions until the expedition authorities have announced their findings? You realize, of course, that the Commission isn't empowered to take an immediate decision.
Yes.
The first minute ended here. There followed a fragment of the second minute, drawn up 11 days later. After due consideration, the commission, composed of 3 doctors, 3 biologists, a physicist, a mechanical engineer, and the deputy head of the expedition, has reached the conclusion that Berton's report is symptomatic of hallucinations caused by atmospheric poisoning, consequent upon inflammation of the associative zone of the cerebral cortex, and that Berton's account bears no, or at any rate no, appreciable relation to reality.
Excuse me. What does no appreciation mean? In what proportion is reality appreciable or not?
I haven't finished. Independently of these conclusions, the Commission has duly registered a dissenting vote from Dr. Archibald Messenger, who considers the phenomena described by Berton to be objectively possible and declares himself in favor of a scrupulous investigation.
I repeat my question.
The answer is simple. No appreciable relation to reality means that phenomena actually observed may have formed the basis of your hallucinations. In the course of a nocturnal stroll, a perfectly sane man can imagine he sees a living creature in a bush stirred by the wind. Such illusions are all the more likely to affect an explorer lost on a strange planet and breathing a poisonous atmosphere. This verdict is in no way prejudicial to you, Berton. Will you now be good enough to let us know your decision?
First of all, I should like to know the possible consequences of the dissenting vote of Dr. Messenger's.
Virtually none. We shall carry on our work along the lines originally laid down.
Is our interview on record?
Yes.
In that case, I should like to say that although the Commission's decision may not be prejudicial to me personally, it is prejudicial to the spirit of the expedition itself. Consequently, as I have already stated, I refuse to answer any further questions.
Is that all?
Yeah, except that I should like to meet Dr. Messenger. Is that possible?
Of course. That was the end of the second minute. At the bottom of the page, there was a note in minuscule handwriting to the effect that the following day, Dr. Messenger had talked to Berton for nearly 3 hours. As a result of this conversation, Messenger had once more begged the Expedition Council to undertake further investigations in order to check the pilot's statements. Berton had produced some new and extremely convincing revelations, which Messenger could not divulge unless the Council reversed its negative decision. The Council, Shanahan, Timolis, and Trahir, rejected the motion, and the affair was closed. The book also reproduced a photocopy of the last page of a letter, or rather, the draft of a letter, found by Messenger's executors after his death. Revincer, in spite of his researches, had been unable to discover if this letter had ever been sent.
Obtuse minds, a pyramid of stupidity.
The text began.
Anxious to preserve its authority, the Council, more precisely Shanahan and Timolis, Trahir's vote doesn't count, has rejected my recommendations. Now, I am taking the matter up directly with the Institute, but as you can well imagine, my protestations won't convince anybody. Bound as I am by oath, I can't, alas, reveal to you what Berton told me. If the Council disregarded Berton's testimony, it was basically because Berton has no scientific training, although any scientist would envy the presence of mind and gift of observation shown by this pilot. I should be grateful if you could send me the following information by return post. 1. Fechner's biography, in particular details about his childhood. 2. Everything you know about his family. Facts, dates. He probably lost his parents while still a child. And 3. I need the topography of the place where he was brought up. I should like once more to tell you what I think about all of this. As you know, sometime after the departure of Fechner and Carucci, a spot appeared in the center of the red sun. The chromospheric eruption caused a magnetic storm chiefly over the southern hemisphere, where our base was situated. According to the information provided by the satellite, the radio links were cut. The other parties were scouring the planet's surface over a relatively restricted area, whereas Fechner and Carucci had traveled a considerable distance from the base. Never, since our arrival on the planet, have we observed such a persistent fog or such an unremitting silence. I imagine that what Berton saw was one of the phases of a kind of Operation Man, which this viscous monster was engaged in. The source of all the various forms observed by Berton is Fechner, or rather, Fechner's brain, subjected to the unimaginable psychic dissection for the purposes of a sort of recreation, an experimental reconstruction based on impressions, undoubtedly the most durable ones, engraved on his memory. I know this sounds fantastic. I know that I may be mistaken, but do please help me. At the moment, I am on the Alaric, where I look forward to receiving your reply. Yours, A.
It was growing dark, and I could scarcely make out the blurred print at the top of the gray page. The last page describing Berton's adventure. For my part, my own experience led me to regard Berton as a trustworthy witness. I turned towards the window. A few clouds still glowed like dying embers above the horizon. The ocean was invisible, blanketed by the purple darkness. The strips of paper fluttered idly beneath the air vents. There was a whiff of ozone in the still, warm air. There was nothing heroic in our decision to remain on the station. The time for heroism was over, vanished with the era of the great interplanetary triumphs, of daring expeditions and sacrifices. Fechner, the ocean's first victim, belonged to a distant past. I had almost stopped caring about the identity of Snow's and Sartorius's visitors. Soon, I told myself, we would cease to be ashamed, to keep ourselves apart. If we could not get rid of our visitors, we would accustom ourselves to their presence, learn to live with them. If their creator altered the rules of the game, we would adapt ourselves to the new rules. Even if at first we jibbed or rebelled, even if one of us despaired and killed himself. Eventually a certain equilibrium would be reestablished. Night had come, no different from many nights on Earth. Now I could make out only the white contours of the basin and the smooth surface of the mirror. I stood up, groping my way to the basin. I fumbled among the objects which cluttered up the shelf, and found the packet of cotton wool. I washed my face with a damp wad and stretched out on the bed. A moth fluttered its wings. No, it was the ventilator strip. The whirring stopped, then started up again. I could no longer see the window. Everything had merged into darkness. A mysterious ray of light pierced the blackness and lingered in front of me. Against the wall or the black sky? I remembered how the blank stare of the night had frightened me the day before, and I smiled at the thought. I was no longer afraid of the night. I was not afraid of anything. I raised my wrist and looked at the ring of phosphorescent figures. Another hour, and the blue day would dawn.
You're watching Abstract Passages with Ben.
And April.
Signing off from Asbury Park.